a question for you. Think about this. What is the most pressure you've ever been under? If you're a parent or caregiver or frontline worker, I'm guessing the last year or so ranks pretty high in terms of pressure. So what helped you? What didn't help you? Our next guest has been studying pressure and asking those same questions for decades. He's spoken with elite athletes, Navy SEALs, emergency room doctors, but also ordinary people trying to balance the pressures we all face. So what have you learned? We're about to find out. Dane Jensen is joining us here this morning to share his findings. Good morning to you.
Hey, Lindsay, how's it going?
So well. Thank you for asking. I mean, this is just such a fascinating topic. Pressure, as we know, is a double-edged sword. It can sharpen us. It can also completely wear us down. I want to talk about Kurt Cronin specifically, because if anyone knows pressure, it is this guy. He's the former commanding officer of the U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6. What did you learn about pressure from him?
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who, when I asked him about the most pressure he'd ever been under, he had to pause for quite a while before he answered the question, because he's been through a lot. But he ended up focusing on a specific situation in which he was leading a team at night on a land-based target about a mile away. And he had a mix of SEAL team soldiers, but also reserve troops who actually had come up on about 2 weeks training, and they started taking enemy fire. And he said what made it so challenging is that he didn't really know how the reserve troops were going to react. And so he said very quickly, I knew I had to make a decision. And he called in some helicopters that were on a 30-second hover, and the strategy worked, which was great. But in the military, they have this thing called after-action reviews, AARs. And he said when we actually did the after-action review, what I learned was that it wasn't the best decision. There were a couple other better options, but he said, even though it was the second or third best decision, the fact that it was made it the best decision.
Interesting.
And that's been a really interesting anchor for me, which is, uncertainty is such a big cause of pressure that the longer we just delay the decision, the more pressure starts to impact us. And so he was a real inspiration for a lot around, direct action and the power of beginning to make progress.
I find this so fascinating. You've come up with an equation. You've spoken with more than 1,000 people. Asked them what's the most pressure you've ever been under, and what I love is this equation that you have, this formula for pressure. So let's take a look at it and maybe walk us through what we're looking at.
Yeah, so, as I talk to all these folks, when you ask people the most pressure they've ever been under, they give you just a vast range of human experience. Like I had, the typical stuff like taking an exam or, a high-pressure sales presentation. But I also had people who, got too far from shore in the ocean and were worried that they couldn't swim back because the tide was going out. And so as I tried to make sense of all these different experiences, what I eventually got down to was that as different as these things are, there are really three things in common. So the first thing that has to be there for human beings to feel pressure is importance. What we're doing has to matter to us. If the outcome isn't important, I'm not going to feel pressure. But there has to be a second thing there as well, because just because something matters to me doesn't necessarily mean it's going to create pressure. The second thing that has to be there is uncertainty. Right? If it really matters to me, but I know exactly how it's going to turn out, there's not going to be that much pressure. It's this intersection of, hey, what I'm doing really matters to me right now, and the outcome is uncertain. That's where we really feel pressure as human beings. And then the third part of it is, listen, we've had to deal with important, uncertain situations since the dawn of time, right? Those two things are not new. What I think is a little bit unique in the modern world is this third piece, which is volume. Just the sheer volume of tasks, of decisions, of distractions that kind of multiply the important, uncertain situations that we find ourselves in. And so almost every high-pressure situation can be, diagnosed using those three components.
So, Dane, what distinguishes pressure from other heightened states like stress or fear or grief, for example? How is pressure different?
Yeah, and this is a terrific question, and this is almost the first thing that everybody asked me when I said, "Hey, what's the most pressure you've ever been under?" They would say, "Well, do you mean pressure or do you mean stress?" And I would say, "Well, what do you think the difference is? Educate me. How are those different for you?" And where I kind of got to on this one is, I always use the metaphor of a basketball game. So my wife is a huge Toronto Raptors fan. We're based in Toronto, to the point where, when we are in the playoffs, if the game is close in the fourth quarter, she has to leave the room, right? She needs to get updates by text message because it's just too stressful to watch the game. And you see, that for me is stress. Mm-hmm. It's not pressure, though, right? Pressure is reserved for the players on the court. right? The people who can actually impact the outcome. And so for me, what differentiates stress from pressure is this imperative that I need to do something. Like I need to act in order to influence how this situation goes.
It's just absolutely fascinating. The book is called The Power of Pressure. Dane, I'm under the pressure of time right now, so I got to go.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Nice to meet you. We'll be right back.
You as well.